230 years ago, if you stood at this exact spot, you would see nothing but wild marshland stretching toward a lazy river. Mosquitoes swarmed in thick clouds. The air smelled of mud and decay. There were no monuments, no marble steps, no grand avenues, just dense forest, clay soil that turned to soup when it rained, and the occasional deer path winding through the underbrush. Today, this address needs no introduction. Every president since John Adams has called it home. Every major decision that shaped the modern world passed through its doors. Wars were declared here. Peace was negotiated here. Civil rights were debated, nuclear codes were guarded, and history itself was written in these rooms. This is the White House. But the story you think you know is only half the truth. The entire untold story behind America's most famous mansion, the White House. Sounds impressive, doesn't it? But strip away the official photographs, the carefully staged press conferences, and the polished tour guide narratives, and you will find something far more complex. This building was not raised by the founding fathers with their own hands. It was not a gift from heaven or a natural outgrowth of American exceptionalism. It was built by ordinary people, most of whose names you will never hear. Stonemasons from Ireland and Scotland who crossed an ocean looking for work. Enslaved men and women whose labor was stolen, whose names were deliberately erased, and whose descendants would wait more than 2 centuries for any acknowledgement at all. The White House has survived fire, war, collapse, scandal, and reinvention. It has watched America transform from a fragile experiment in Republican government into a global superpower. Along the way, it absorbed every contradiction, every compromise, and every dark secret that came with that transformation. Behind the elegant columns and freshly painted walls are stories of political horse trading, structural failure, hidden laborers, and decisions made in desperation that changed the lives of millions. So what is the White House really? A symbol of democracy and freedom? A monument to American ingenuity? Or a physical reminder that even our most sacred spaces are built on foundations we would rather not examine too closely? If you enjoy deep investigations into historic architecture, the hidden labor that built America's landmarks, and the untold stories behind the symbols we take for granted, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments what other iconic building or monument you would like me to explore next. Your support makes these detailed, research-driven stories possible, and I read every single comment. Now, before we can understand the White House itself, the mansion, the symbol, the political theater, we first have to understand why anyone in their right mind would choose to build the capital of a new nation in one of the least hospitable places imaginable. The answer, as with so much of early American history, comes down to backroom deals, regional jealousy, and the messy, undignified work of holding together 13 former colonies that did not particularly like or trust each other. In the summer of 1790, the United States was barely holding itself together. The Revolutionary War had been won, yes, but the harder question of what kind of country would emerge from that victory remained painfully unsettled. The Constitution had been ratified only a year earlier, and already the cracks were showing. The federal government had no money, no credit, and no clear way to pay the massive debts left over from the war. The states bickered constantly. Regional resentment simmered just below the surface, and in the halls of the temporary capital in New York City, a bitter political deadlock threatened to tear the whole fragile experiment apart before it ever really began. At the center of this crisis stood Alexander Hamilton, the ambitious, relentless Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton had a plan, a bold, controversial financial program designed to pull the new nation back from the edge of bankruptcy. The core of his proposal was simple but explosive. The federal government would assume all the war debts of the individual states, consolidating them into a single national obligation. This would establish the creditworthiness of the United States, stabilize the economy, and create a strong central government with real financial power. Southern representatives hated it. They saw Hamilton's plan as a Northern power grab, a scheme that would enrich Northern speculators and bankers at the expense of Southern states, many of which had already paid off most of their war debts. Why, they asked, should Virginia taxpayers bail out Massachusetts? Why should the South finance Northern prosperity? The proposal deadlocked in Congress. Votes were taken, defeated, revised, and defeated again. Hamilton, normally so confident and quick with solutions, found himself stuck. Enter Thomas Jefferson, Recently returned from France, where he had served as minister, Jefferson had just taken up his new role as Secretary of State. He was still adjusting to the political landscape back home, still catching up on the feuds and alliances that had formed in his absence. Jefferson was no friend of Hamilton's economic vision. He feared concentrated federal power and distrusted the commercial interests Hamilton represented. But he also recognized that the deadlock was dangerous. If the government could not pay its debts, if it collapsed into dysfunction this early, the whole Republican experiment might fail. European powers, still skeptical that democracy could work on a large scale, would be proven right. So Jefferson proposed a meeting, something informal, away from the rigid posturing of the congressional floor. A private dinner at his residence on Maiden Lane in New York City. He invited Hamilton and James Madison, the influential Virginia congressman who was leading much of the opposition to Hamilton's plan. The three men gathered around Jefferson's table on a summer evening, and over wine and carefully prepared dishes, they began to negotiate. What emerged from that dinner was one of the most consequential political bargains in American history. It was not written down in any official document. No votes were taken. No public announcements were made. But the deal was clear. Hamilton would get his assumption plan. Madison would deliver enough Southern votes to pass it through Congress. And in exchange, the permanent capital of the United States, the seat of federal power, would be located on the Potomac River, on land carved from Maryland and Virginia, firmly in the South. This was no small concession. At the time, several established cities were competing fiercely to become the permanent capital. Philadelphia had been serving as the temporary seat of government and wanted to keep the honor. New York had hosted the Continental Congress and the first inauguration of George Washington. Baltimore was a thriving port with strong commercial ties and existing infrastructure. Each city had powerful advocates, deep pockets, and practical advantages that a patch of undeveloped wilderness along the Potomac could never match. But practical advantages were not the only considerations. For Southern planters, including George Washington himself, the location had obvious appeal. Washington owned significant property in the region. So did many other influential Virginians and Marylanders. They stood to profit enormously from the land speculation that would inevitably follow once the capital was established. Property values would soar. New towns would spring up. Contracts for construction, supplies, and services would flow to local businesses. The economic benefits alone made the deal attractive. Beyond money, though, there was symbolism. A capital built from nothing, rising out of the wilderness on the banks of the Potomac, could be imagined as a pure expression of Republican virtue. It would not be tainted by the commercial corruption that many Southerners associated with northern cities. It would not carry the baggage of colonial history or the influence of entrenched merchant elites. It could be designed from the ground up to reflect the ideals of the new republic, a city of broad avenues, classical monuments, and rational planning. In the minds of its advocates, it would become an American Rome, a planned capital worthy of a nation that saw itself as the heir to ancient Republican traditions. Of course, there was another side to this vision. The Potomac site was remote, undeveloped, and wildly impractical. In modern terms, it would be like deciding to build a new national capital not in an existing metropolitan area, but in a humid, mosquito-infested floodplain hours away from any functioning city. The land flooded regularly. The summer heat was oppressive. Diseases like malaria and yellow fever were common. There were no roads worth the name, no nearby sources of skilled labor, and no infrastructure to support the kind of grand building projects that a new capital would require. But the political logic of the deal outweighed these practical concerns. The South got the capital. The North got financial stability, and the Union, at least for the moment, held together. On July 16, 1790, President George Washington signed the Residence Act into law. The legislation designated a federal district of 10 miles square along the Potomac River as the permanent seat of government. The exact location within that area would be chosen by the president himself. The temporary capital would remain in Philadelphia for 10 years, giving the new city time to take shape. And Washington, with his military precision and his personal stake in the region's success, would oversee every major decision about the planning and construction of the federal buildings. What followed was an experiment on a scale America had never attempted. The task was not simply to construct a few government buildings. It was to create an entire capital city almost from scratch, to impose order and grandeur on a landscape that nature had never intended for such purposes. And at the heart of that experiment, quite literally at the center of the new city's plan, would stand the president's house. If you are going to build a capital city in a swamp, you need someone with enough imagination to see past the mud and enough arrogance to believe the vision can actually be realized. George Washington found that man in Pierre Charles L'Enfant, a French-born engineer and architect who had served with distinction during the Revolutionary War. L'Enfant had worked on fortifications, designed medals and insignia, and demonstrated a flair for the dramatic and the monumental. More importantly, he shared Washington's belief that the new capital should not just be functional but symbolic, a city whose very layout would embody the principles of the republic it served. L'Enfant arrived at the Potomac site in March of 1791, accompanied by a small team of surveyors. What he found was not encouraging. The designated federal district included a few scattered settlements, Georgetown and Alexandria among them, but most of the land was forest, field, and swamp. The terrain was uneven, cut through by creeks and ravines. The soil was heavy clay that turned into impassable mud whenever it rained. Clouds of mosquitoes rose from standing water. In the summer, the heat and humidity were suffocating. In the winter, cold winds swept across the open ground. Most men would have seen these conditions as obstacles, problems to be managed and minimized. L'Enfant saw them as raw material. Where others noticed mud, he imagined sweeping boulevards. Where they saw tangled forest, he envisioned long, dramatic vistas stretching from hilltop to hilltop. He was not designing a city for the fragile young republic that existed in 1791. He was designing for the powerful empire he believed America would one day become. The plan L'Enfant presented to Washington that summer was audacious. Some would say insane. At its core was a grid of streets running east-west and north-south, practical and orderly. But overlaid on that grid were bold diagonal avenues radiating from key points like spokes from the hub of a wheel. These avenues would be wide, far wider than any street in Philadelphia or New York, broad enough for grand processions and military parades. They would create long sight lines, dramatic perspectives that would allow a person standing at one monument to see clear across the city to another. It was a design language borrowed from the great European capitals, from Versailles and Baroque Rome, and adapted to the needs of a republic. L'Enfant identified two prominent hills within the federal district and marked them as the twin poles of American government. The first, Jenkins Hill, rose on the eastern side of the planned city. L'Enfant called it a pedestal waiting for a monument. This would be the site of the Congress House, what we now call the Capitol, the seat of legislative power. The second hill, about a mile and a half to the northwest, would host the President's House, the executive mansion from which the nation's chief magistrate would govern. These two structures, L'Enfant insisted, had to command clear views of one another. A broad public mall would stretch between them, a grand open space for ceremonies, gatherings, and the everyday life of the Republic. The visual line connecting the Capitol and the President's House would symbolize the relationship between the legislative and executive branches, separate but linked, each visible to the other, each held in balance by the Constitution. In L'Enfant's mind, the President's House was meant to be truly palatial. He envisioned a residence roughly 5 times larger than the building that would eventually be constructed. A sprawling complex with multiple wings, grand reception halls, offices for government business, and living quarters suited to a head of state who would receive foreign ambassadors and host dignitaries from around the world. Set high on its hill, the mansion would function as a Republican palace, visible from the Potomac River and from the avenues converging upon it. Broad prospects would stretch out in every direction, allowing the president, at least symbolically, to survey the city and the country entrusted to his care. For months, L'Enfant worked with manic energy, surveying the land, sketching plans, and issuing orders. He reported directly to Washington, often bypassing the 3 commissioners the president had appointed to oversee the city's day-to-day development. This did not sit well with the commissioners, who saw L'Enfant as arrogant and insubordinate. Tensions escalated. L'Enfant refused to release detailed copies of his plan, fearing that speculators would use the information to buy up land along the planned avenues before the government could acquire it. He insisted that his vision be executed exactly as he had conceived it, with no compromises, no cuts, and no interference from bureaucrats who lacked his genius. The breaking point came in the autumn of 1791. A wealthy landowner named Daniel Carroll, who happened to be the nephew of one of the commissioners, had begun constructing a large manor house on land that fell directly in the path of one of Elephant's planned avenues. Elephant had warned Carroll to stop. Carroll, confident in his connections, ignored the warning and continued building. So Elephant, without seeking approval from the commissioners or from Washington, ordered his workers to tear the house down. They did. The walls came crashing down, and Daniel Carroll was left standing in the ruins of his half-finished mansion, furious and humiliated. This act of unilateral demolition was the final straw. The commissioners demanded Elephant's dismissal. Washington, who admired Elephant's vision but could not tolerate his refusal to work within the chain of command, reluctantly agreed. In February of 1792, less than a year after he had arrived full of grand plans and boundless confidence, Pierre Charles Elephant was removed from the project. He left Washington in bitterness, convinced that smaller minds had sabotaged his masterpiece. He would spend the rest of his life petitioning for payment and recognition, never receiving either in the measure he believed he deserved. But even in defeat, Elephant's vision survived. The commissioners kept the essential elements of his plan, the grid with diagonal avenues, the siting of the Capitol and the President's house, the broad mall stretching between them. They trimmed back some of his more extravagant ideas, but the bones of his design remained. Washington City, as it slowly took shape over the next decade, would bear Elephant's stamp, even if his name was largely forgotten. With Elephant gone, the next challenge was immediate and practical. The President's house had to be designed, and unlike the grand, sprawling palace Elephant had imagined, this mansion would have to be something more modest, more realistic, something that could actually be built with the limited funds and labor available. The commissioners decided to hold a public competition, inviting architects and builders from across the young nation to submit their plans. The prize would be $500 or a medal of equal value, a significant sum for the time. The winning design would define the home of the American presidency for generations to come. What they received in response was a fascinating mix of ambition, practicality, and confusion, a snapshot of how Americans in 1792 were still trying to figure out what kind of executive their republic should have. The advertisement for the President's House design competition ran in newspapers across the United States in March of 1792. The instructions were deliberately vague and almost certainly on purpose. The building should be large enough to accommodate the president, his family, and the necessary staff. It should be dignified but not ostentatious, grand enough to impress foreign visitors but restrained enough to reassure nervous citizens that their president was not becoming a king. Beyond these guidelines, the details were left to each designer's imagination. That ambiguity opened the door to wildly different interpretations of what a Republican executive mansion should look like. The entries that arrived over the spring and summer revealed just how uncertain Americans were about the image they wanted to project. Some designs leaned heavily on European palace traditions. They showed long facades, multiple wings, elaborate ornament, and ceremonial spaces that would not have looked out of place at Versailles or in a royal residence in London. These submissions, unsurprisingly, found little favor with the commissioners. The new republic was barely a decade removed from throwing off British rule. The last thing anyone wanted was a president's house that looked like it belonged to a monarch. Other entries swung to the opposite extreme. They proposed buildings so plain and modest that they might have been the townhouses of prosperous merchants, functional and respectable but utterly lacking the gravitas needed to host foreign ambassadors or project national authority. These designs were practical, but they missed the larger point. The president's house was not just a home, it was a symbol. It had to communicate that the United States was a serious nation, stable and creditworthy, capable of standing alongside the established powers of Europe. One particularly intriguing submission came from an anonymous entrant who signed only with the initials AZ. The design proposed a villa-like structure clearly inspired by the work of Andrea Palladio, the Italian Renaissance architect whose influence had spread across Europe and into the American colonies. The plan featured a central rotunda with symmetrical wings extending on either side, a composition that was sophisticated, carefully proportioned, and obviously the work of someone with real architectural training. Later research, and a fair bit of educated guessing, would suggest that this anonymous design came from Thomas Jefferson himself. Jefferson's love for Palladian architecture was no secret. His own home, Monticello, was a testament to that influence. And as Secretary of State, he had both the interest and the knowledge to submit a serious proposal. But his design, however refined, had problems. It felt too grand, too European, too close to the aristocratic villas he had admired during his years in France. Accepting it would look like favoritism toward a powerful cabinet member. Rejecting it openly would create a political embarrassment. The simplest solution was to set it aside quietly and move on. Many of the other entries exposed a more fundamental problem. The United States in 1792 had very few trained architects in the European sense of the word. Most buildings were designed and constructed by craftsmen who had learned their trade through apprenticeship and hands-on experience, not through formal study of classical proportions and architectural theory. As a result, many of the competition submissions were structurally sound and practical, but they lacked the refinement, the balance, and the subtle mastery of proportion that would give the building real presence and authority. The commissioners reviewed the entries with growing frustration. None of them quite hit the mark. Some came close in certain respects, but failed in others. The deadline passed, and still there was no clear winner. It began to look as though the competition might end in disappointment, forcing the commissioners to either extend the deadline or abandon the idea altogether and hire someone directly. It was at this point, when the competition seemed ready to fizzle out, that a new design arrived. It came not from one of the established architects in Philadelphia or New York, but from an Irish immigrant builder working in Charleston, South Carolina. His name was James Hoban, and his proposal would go on to define the visual identity of the American presidency for more than 2 centuries. James Hoban was born around 1755 in County Kilkenny, Ireland, in the rural townland of Cuffesgrange. His family were tenant farmers, part of the Catholic majority living under the harsh restrictions of the penal laws, which limited their rights to own property, practice many professions, and participate fully in public life. For a young man with talent but no powerful connections, Ireland offered little opportunity. But Hoban had ambition and skill. As a teenager, he apprenticed with a local builder, learning the hands-on work of masonry and carpentry. His ability was noticed, and he was eventually sponsored to attend the Dublin Society's drawing school, one of the few institutions in Ireland where talented young men from modest backgrounds could receive formal training in architectural drawing, perspective, and the classical orders. During his years in Dublin, Hoban encountered a building that would shape his entire approach to architecture. Leinster House, the grand townhouse of the Duke of Leinster, completed in 1748 to designs by the German architect Richard Cassels. Leinster House was Georgian architecture at its finest, solid, symmetrical, restrained, and elegant. It projected aristocratic authority without the heavy ornamentation of Baroque palaces. Its proportions were calm and rational. Its facade was balanced and dignified. For Hoban, who was studying and likely working on buildings in this tradition, Leinster House represented an ideal architecture that spoke of permanence and seriousness without tipping into royal excess. After the American Revolution, thousands of Irish immigrants crossed the Atlantic in search of better opportunities. Hoban was among them. He arrived in the United States sometime in the mid-1780s and eventually settled in Charleston, South Carolina, where a building boom driven by the port economy was creating steady demand for skilled craftsmen. Hoban quickly built a reputation as both a builder and an architect. By 1792, he had completed several important commissions, including work on the South Carolina State Capitol building, a structure that would later be destroyed by fire. When word of the competition for the president's house reached Charleston, Hoban recognized an opportunity that might never come again. He prepared his submission carefully, drawing heavily on his memories of Leinster House and adapting its Georgian restraint for an American context. His proposal called for a 3-story structure, counting the raised basement, built in stone with a central entrance and evenly spaced rows of windows across the front. The plan was essentially a refined rectangle. Large state rooms on the principal floor, family quarters above, service spaces below. It was practical, dignified, and clearly rooted in the Irish-Georgian tradition he had absorbed in Dublin. Crucially, Hoban understood something many of his competitors had misjudged: scale. His building was large enough to be impressive, to host state dinners and receive foreign dignitaries, but it was not so overwhelming that it looked like a palace. Where Elephant had imagined a residence 5 times larger, and Jefferson had proposed an elaborate villa, Hoban offered a structure that could realistically be built within a reasonable budget and timeline while still giving the office of the president the visual weight it needed. Hoban's design also carried a subtle advantage, a kind of studied neutrality. It avoided dramatic stylistic gestures that could be read as political statements. The Georgian language was already familiar in America from colonial public buildings and private houses. It felt established rather than experimental, classical rather than fashionable, stable rather than showy. In a moment of sharp political division, when every decision about the new capital was scrutinized for hidden meanings and partisan advantage, that kind of architectural diplomacy may have been exactly what the commissioners wanted, even if they never articulated it explicitly. When the commissioners met in July of 1792 to make their final decision, Hoban's plan stood out. It was not the most daring or the most ornate. It did not break new ground or propose radical innovations. But it combined competence, clarity, and the right level of ambition. It looked like a house where a president could live and work without apology or embarrassment. President Washington, who took an active role in the final selection, reportedly appreciated both the practicality and the dignity of Hoban's design. On July 16, 1792, exactly 2 years after the Residence Act was signed, James Hoban was declared the winner of the competition. He received the promised prize of $500, and far more importantly, the commission to oversee the construction of the president's house. The little-known Irish immigrant who had crossed the ocean with nothing but his skills and his ambition had just secured the chance to design and build the most important residence in the new republic. But winning the competition was the easy part. Now came the hard work, turning neat lines on paper into stone walls rising out of muddy ground. And that work, as Hoban would soon discover, would test every skill he had, every ounce of patience he could muster, and every compromise he was willing to make. The ceremonial laying of the cornerstone for the president's house took place on October 13, 1792, in a formal Masonic ritual led by the Lodge of Georgetown. The event was carefully staged, complete with symbolic tools, measured steps, and speeches that emphasized the dignity and permanence of the project. To the dignitaries in attendance, the ceremony must have felt like a moment of triumph, a visible sign that the ambitious plans for the new capital were finally taking physical form. In reality, the ceremony blessed the start of what would become one of the most grueling construction projects of the era, carried out in a location that seemed almost designed by nature to resist human ambition. The site for the president's house sat on a modest rise, not the commanding hilltop Elephant had once imagined, but high enough to offer some drainage and a view. That slight elevation would prove crucial because the surrounding ground was stubbornly wet, prone to flooding, and underlaid with clay soil that turned into sticky, impassable mud whenever it rained. Before a single foundation stone could be laid, the land itself had to be tamed. The area was thickly wooded, covered in oak, pine, and dense underbrush. Crews spent weeks cutting down trees, pulling stumps with chains and oxen, and clearing the thick tangle of vegetation. It was backbreaking work, and progress was slow. Even after the trees were gone, the ground had to be graded and leveled, a task made infinitely harder by the clay-heavy soil and the constant threat of rain. Workers dug drainage ditches to pull water away from the future basement, but these channels required constant maintenance. Seasonal floods from the Potomac tested every temporary solution. For much of that first year, the construction site looked less like the foundation of a national monument and more like a chaotic mud pit. Shovels were used far more than chisels. Brute physical labor, hauling, digging, leveling, dominated the early months. The workforce that gathered on this muddy rise reflected the deeply unequal world of early American labor. At the top of the hierarchy were skilled craftsmen, many of them immigrants from Ireland and Scotland, who knew how to handle stone and wood with precision. These men commanded relatively high wages, often $1 or more per day, a respectable rate in the 1790s. Their expertise was indispensable. Without them, the project would have been impossible. Working alongside these master craftsmen were local laborers, men drawn by the promise of steady pay and the rare opportunity to say they had helped build something the entire nation was watching. Their wages were lower, their status less secure, but they were free men who could negotiate their terms, walk away if conditions became unbearable, or seek work elsewhere if a better opportunity arose. And then there were the enslaved workers. From the very beginning, the project leaned heavily on enslaved labor. The commissioners, always short of money and struggling to attract enough workers to this remote and unhealthy site, turned to the solution that Virginia and Maryland elites had been using for generations. They hired enslaved men from nearby plantations, renting them out by the season or the year. The payments went not to the men doing the work, but to the people who claimed to own them. Almost all of the heaviest, dirtiest work fell on the shoulders of enslaved black men. They cleared the land, dug the foundation trenches, hauled stone and timber, and mixed mortar in steaming kettles under the brutal summer sun. This system kept costs down and kept the work moving, but it also stamped a brutal and inescapable truth into the very foundations of the president's house. Men who would never be allowed to vote, who would never count as full citizens, who could be bought and sold like livestock, were building the home from which laws and policies about their own bondage would one day be signed. The commissioner's account books recorded payments to slaveholders with cold, bureaucratic precision. Money paid to Charles Digges for 5 Negro men for 1 year. Payment to Notley Young for hire of slaves. The ledgers listed plantation owners by name but reduced the actual workers to categories. Negro hire, slave labor. Even on paper, even in the dry language of bookkeeping, the people whose bodies made the house possible were rendered faceless and anonymous. As late 1792 slid into winter, the foundation work continued at a slow, grinding pace. Crews excavated the basement level, which would eventually hold kitchens, storage rooms, and service corridors. The foundation walls were laid in local stone, set in lime mortar, and built course by course. Each section had to sit and harden before more weight could be added on top. Progress was measured in inches, not feet. Winter brought freezing temperatures that could crack fresh mortar, short daylight hours that limited working time, and the simple physical misery of outdoor labor in cold, wind, and mud. By the spring of 1793, after more than 6 months of relentless effort, the site finally reached a crucial turning point. The outline of the basement was in place. The foundations were secure. The muddy hill above the Potomac was ready for something the eye could actually see. The stage was set for the most demanding and most visible phase of the project, raising the heavy stone walls that would give the president's house its shape, its presence, and its place on the American horizon. With the foundations secure and the spring of 1793 bringing warmer weather and longer days, the real work began. This was the moment when Hoban's careful drawings had to translate into solid three-dimensional form, when abstract plans became physical walls that would stand for centuries. It was a process that demanded precision, patience, and a constant supply of raw materials. And every step of that process, from quarry to finished wall, passed through many hands and involved risks that could injure or kill without warning. The main building material for the president's house was Aquia Creek sandstone, quarried in Stafford County, Virginia, roughly 40 miles south of the construction site. The choice was both practical and symbolic. The stone was relatively soft compared to granite, which meant masons could cut and shape it more easily. It existed in large enough quantities to supply a project of this scale, and most importantly, it could be transported by water. The quarries lay close to navigable creeks and inlets that fed into the Potomac River, so massive blocks of stone could be loaded onto barges and floated upstream to the capital. Without this water route, the rough, narrow dirt roads of the era would never have survived the weight and volume of stone required. At the quarries, the work was dangerous and exhausting. Workers, again a mix of free laborers and enslaved men hired from nearby plantations, used hammers, iron wedges, and crowbars to split stone along its natural grain. The process required experience and a keen eye. A poorly placed wedge could shatter a block, wasting hours of effort. A block that broke free suddenly could roll and crush anyone standing in the wrong place. Once a rough block was freed from the bedrock, it had to be maneuvered onto wooden sledges or rollers and dragged to the water's edge, where cranes, built from timber and rope, lifted the stones onto waiting barges. The barge trip upriver could take several days, depending on wind, current, and tide. The Potomac was not an easy river to navigate. Sandbars shifted. Strong currents could push barges off course. Storms could rise suddenly, turning the water choppy and dangerous. By the time a load of stone reached the wharves at Georgetown, many blocks bore chipped edges or hairline cracks. Before the stone could be incorporated into the mansion's walls, it needed more work, trimming damaged sections, squaring off rough edges, and discarding pieces that were too far gone to be saved. Once the stone arrived at the building site, the real transformation began. Skilled stonemasons, many of them Irish and Scottish immigrants trained in the Georgian building traditions of the British Isles, took over. With hammers, chisels, and years of hard-won experience, they turned rough blocks into ashlar, the clean, rectangular stones that give the president's house its calm, orderly appearance. A single block might take hours of steady work to finish. The mason would knock off excess stone, sharpen corners, check the face with a straight edge, and refine the surface until it matched the precise measurements in Hoban's drawings. There was no room for error. A stone cut too short or shaped incorrectly could not be patched or fixed. It had to be discarded, taking with it all the labor already invested. The best masons worked with a steady, almost meditative rhythm, their hands reading the stone, their tools striking with confidence born from thousands of hours of practice. At the same time, other crews were producing the mortar that would bind the stones together. Lime mortar in the 1790s was made by burning limestone in kilns at intense heat for days, then carefully slaking the resulting quicklime with water. The process was demanding and dangerous. Quicklime reacted violently with water, releasing intense heat and caustic fumes that could burn skin and damage lungs. Workers had to know exactly how much water to add, how long to let the mixture sit, and how to blend the slaked lime with sand to create a mortar that would harden into a strong, durable bond. The mix had to be right. Too much lime and the mortar would shrink and crack as it dried. Too little, and it would never gain the strength needed to hold up heavy stone walls. Skilled masons mixed the mortar in small batches just before use, knowing that once exposed to air, it would begin to set and could not be stored for later. Building the walls was slow, methodical work. Each course of finished ashlar had to be laid perfectly level before another could be added on top. Masons used plumb lines to keep the vertical edges true and spirit levels to ensure the horizontal courses did not tilt. They knew that even small errors at the lower levels would multiply as the structure rose, creating instability that could threaten the entire building. Wooden scaffolding rose alongside the walls, tied together with rope and constantly adjusted as the structure climbed higher. Workers hauled stones up ramps or lifted them with block and tackle, guiding each piece into position with shouted instructions and careful hand signals. The work was physically punishing. Stone is heavy. The summer heat along the Potomac was oppressive. Sweat, stone dust, and the smell of fresh mortar filled the air. The work did not stop for whether so much as bend under its pressure. Summers brought intense heat, humidity, and swarms of insects. Workers labored in thin clothing, their skin burned by the sun and the caustic lime. Winters brought freezing winds that numbed fingers and threatened to damage fresh mortar if temperatures dropped too quickly. Rain turned the site into a muddy mess, halting work for days at a time while the ground dried out enough to be safe. By modern standards, the pace of construction was agonizingly slow. Weeks of effort might raise a wall only a few feet. But step by step, stone by stone, the building took shape. The walls climbed higher. The rectangular footprint of Hoban's design became visible. Window openings were left as the courses rose, their dimensions carefully checked against the drawings. A central section on the south facade was reserved for the future entrance portico. Gradually, what had been a muddy construction site began to look like a building. The south facade, which would one day be the most photographed side of the White House, took shape first. The pale sandstone, fresh from the quarry, stood out against the surrounding forest and the flat expanse of the Potomac floodplain. From a distance, Travelers approaching the site could finally see proof that the ambitious promises made in Philadelphia were being translated into physical reality. But every inch of that progress, every course of stone laid, every joint filled with mortar depended entirely on human labor. And to truly understand what the president's house cost, beyond the money appropriated by Congress, beyond the political deals and architectural ambitions, we have to look closely at the people doing the work. We have to ask who they were, what they were paid, and what their presence on this site says about the nation the building was meant to represent. The workforce that raised the president's house from foundation to roofline was never a single unified team. It was a constantly shifting collection of people divided by skill, by status, by race, and by the most fundamental question of all, whether they were free or enslaved. On any given day in the 1790s, the construction site was a microcosm of the new republic itself, a place where the highest ideals and the ugliest contradictions existed side by side, impossible to separate. At the top of the labor hierarchy stood the European-trained master craftsmen. These were the men whose skills simply could not be replaced, stonemasons who could read the grain of rock and shape it with precision, carpenters who could frame a roof or fit a staircase with mathematical accuracy, glaziers who could set glass without wasting expensive pains. Many of these craftsmen had emigrated from Ireland, Scotland, and England, drawn by the promise of higher wages and greater opportunity than they could hope for in the rigid class systems of Europe. James Hoban, as the architect and superintendent of construction, maintained close ties to the Irish building community. He recruited heavily from Charleston, where he had built his own reputation, and from other port cities along the Atlantic coast where Irish workers had settled. These master craftsmen earned substantial wages by the standards of the time, often between $1 and $2 per day, plus room and board. Their names appear again and again in the commissioner's account books. Colin Williamson, a Scottish stonemason who oversaw much of the exterior work. Philip Hart and John Sheehan, Irish carpenters responsible for interior framing and finish work. Below the master craftsmen were journeymen and apprentices, men still learning the trade or not yet established enough to command the highest rates. They might earn 50 to 75 cents a day, still a decent income that could support a family and eventually fund their own rise to master status. For these men, working on the president's house was more than just a job. It was a credential, proof of skill that could open doors for the rest of their careers. The commissioners tried hard to attract these skilled workers. They placed advertisements in newspapers across the mid-Atlantic states, promising steady employment on a project of national importance, decent pay, and the honor of contributing to the creation of the new capital. But despite these efforts, keeping the site fully staffed was a constant struggle. Washington City's remoteness, its oppressive summer climate, and the availability of other work in older, more comfortable cities meant the president's house was always competing for labor. Workers would arrive, work for a season or two, and then move on, lured by better conditions or higher pay elsewhere. That persistent shortage of skilled labor pushed the commissioners toward a solution that required no recruitment, no competitive wages, and no concern for worker satisfaction. Increasingly, they turned to enslaved labor. They signed contracts with local plantation owners, hiring out enslaved men for a month, a season, or an entire year. The commissioners paid the owners. The men doing the work received nothing beyond basic food and minimal shelter. The account books document this system in language that is both precise and dehumanizing. Payment to Charles Digges for 5 Negro men hired for 1 year. Money to Notley Young for hire of slaves. Payment to various owners for Negro carpenters, Negro laborers, Negro masons. The plantation owners are listed by name. The workers themselves, with rare exceptions, are reduced to categories or listed by first name only, stripped of surnames, stripped of individuality, reduced to units of labor. These enslaved men carried the heaviest and most dangerous burdens on the construction site. They quarried stone, hauling massive blocks with ropes and levers in conditions that could maim or kill without warning. They mixed mortar in steaming kettles, breathing caustic fumes and risking chemical burns. They hauled materials up scaffolding, their footing uncertain on rough planks tied together with rope. They dug drainage ditches in clay soil, cleared stumps, and performed all the grinding, unglamorous labor that a project of this scale required. But enslaved workers were not only muscle. Some brought real skill to the site. Documents mention enslaved carpenters, bricklayers, and stonemasons whose craftsmanship was indispensable. Yet even when their expertise matched that of free workers, they were typically valued at lower rates in the account books, and every cent of their supposed wages went to their enslavers. A man who could shape stone with the precision of a master mason, whose hands were as skilled as any Irish immigrant, would finish a day's work knowing that he owned nothing, not his labor, not his time, not even his own body. The conditions these men worked under would test even modern construction crews with better tools and safety equipment. Summer along the Potomac was suffocating. Temperatures soared into the 90s. Humidity hung in the air like a wet blanket. Mosquitoes swarmed from standing water, carrying diseases like malaria and yellow fever. Enslaved workers labored in thin, ragged clothing and worn-out shoes. Their rations were calculated for low cost, not nutrition or health. They slept in rough barracks or temporary shelters, waking before dawn to begin another day of grinding labor. Working side by side, free and enslaved, did not erase the social lines that divided them. If anything, it made those lines sharper and more painful. Some free laborers resented the presence of enslaved men on the site, arguing that slave labor drove down wages and made it harder for free workers to negotiate better terms. From their perspective, they were competing against men who had no power to refuse work or demand fair pay, and that competition undermined the bargaining power of everyone who was free. Enslavers, meanwhile, treated their workers as investments, property that had to be protected from damage. If an enslaved man was injured, if he fell from scaffolding or was crushed by falling stone, the enslaver did not mourn a human being. He calculated financial loss and demanded compensation from the commissioners for his damaged property. The account books record these transactions with the same cold precision they used for everything else. Payment for injury to slave, compensation for death of hired Negro, human suffering reduced to line items in a ledger. The commissioners had to juggle all of this, mediating disputes between free workers and slaveholders, responding to complaints about injuries and delays, and trying to keep enough hands on the job as people fell ill, ran away, or simply refused to continue under such brutal conditions. The federal government, which would later claim the president's house as a symbol of liberty and democracy, was in these years actively participating in and profiting from the slave system. And despite the government's reputation for detailed record-keeping, enslaved workers were systematically erased from the official story. Free workers appeared in the records by full name and trade. Paid to John Davis, mason. Paid to William Johnson, carpenter. Enslaved men appeared as categories, or at best, as first names attached to an owner's account. Years of backbreaking labor on the nation's most symbolic building might be summed up in a single bland entry: Negro hire. It would take generations, literally centuries, before historians began the slow, painstaking work of pulling these figures out of the shadows. They tracked down scattered references in letters and diaries. They cross-checked plantation ledgers with commissioners' accounts. They searched for probate records, sale documents, and any other scrap of paper that might provide a name, a trade, a fragment of a life. Slowly, some of those names have been recovered. Some of those stories, incomplete and fragmented as they are, have been brought back into the light. But for every name recovered, dozens remain lost. For every story pieced together, countless others have disappeared completely, erased by a system that saw these men as property, not people, and by a historical memory that for too long preferred comforting myths over uncomfortable truths. By the autumn of 1800, after nearly 8 years of construction, the president's house was still frustratingly unfinished. Whole sections of the interior remained bare plaster or raw framing. The grounds were cluttered with construction debris. But time had run out. The 10-year deal that allowed Philadelphia to serve as the temporary capital had expired, and the federal government was obligated by law to move to Washington, ready or not. President John Adams, nearing the end of his bitterly contested single term, found himself moving into a residence that was, in many respects, still a construction site. The building that awaited the Adams family was a study in contradictions. From the outside, it looked impressive. The Aquia Creek sandstone walls, though not yet painted white, gave the mansion a commanding presence on its low hill. The roof was in place, finally keeping out the rain. But inside, the reality was far less grand. Only 6 rooms had been plastered, and made even remotely livable. Staircases stood half-finished. The planned grand entrance on the north front had no portico, so visitors climbed temporary wooden steps that looked more suited to a barn than a presidential residence. Adams left Philadelphia in early November 1800, traveling south along rough roads while wagons hauled his furniture and official papers. He arrived at the president's house on November 1st, becoming the first chief executive to sleep under its unfinished roof. His wife, Abigail, stayed behind in Massachusetts for several more weeks to settle family business. On his first night in the building, alone in the cold, half-empty rooms, Adams wrote a letter to Abigail that would later be carved into American mythology. I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house, and on all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof. It was a beautiful sentiment, full of hope and Republican virtue. But when Abigail Adams finally arrived in mid-November, her reaction to the reality of life in the president's house was considerably less romantic. In letters to friends and family, she described not a noble residence but a daily struggle with cold, discomfort, and improvisation. The house was freezing. Only a handful of fireplaces had been completed and were drawing properly. Firewood in the new capital was scarce and expensive, so keeping even a few rooms tolerably warm required constant effort and planning. Outside the mansion, there was almost nothing. Washington City was still a collection of scattered buildings separated by muddy fields and half-finished streets. There were few shops, no real markets, and almost none of the services that made daily life manageable in an established city. The Adamses and their small household staff had to make do with what they could scavenge or import from elsewhere. Abigail's most famous adjustment involved the East Room, the largest space in the house, designed for grand receptions and state ceremonies. In 1800, with bare walls, rough flooring, and no furniture, it was useless for anything formal. So Abigail turned it into a laundry room. The space was large and airy, perfect for hanging wet clothes to dry. Soon, the room meant to host elegant gatherings of diplomats and dignitaries, was filled with damp linens, shirts, and undergarments strung on makeshift lines. The image is almost comic, the first family's laundry swaying in the drafts where the Republic had imagined glittering assemblies and high political theater. Inside this half-finished shell, the Adams household struggled to maintain even basic routines. Servants hauled water by hand from nearby springs because the house had no plumbing. Cooking took place in the basement kitchen over open fires, with hot dishes then carried up narrow staircases to the family's rooms. With so few finished spaces, official entertaining happened in cramped, awkward settings that fell far short of what a head of state needed to receive foreign diplomats or host congressional leaders. Fortunately for the Adams family, this uncomfortable chapter did not last long. Adams lost the fiercely contested and deeply personal election of 1800 to Thomas Jefferson, his former friend and ally turned bitter political rival. The defeat stung. Adams, wounded and angry, reportedly left Washington before dawn on Inauguration Day in March 1801, heading back to Massachusetts and deliberately avoiding Jefferson's swearing-in ceremony. It was an undignified end to a difficult presidency, and it meant that Adams would live in the unfinished president's house for only about 4 months. The task of turning the mansion from a barely habitable shell into something closer to its intended purpose would fall to Thomas Jefferson, the man who had once anonymously submitted his own design in the original competition. His years in the president's house would bring real improvements to the building, but they would also expose, more clearly than almost any other presidency, the vast gap between American ideals and American realities. Thomas Jefferson moved into the president's house in March of 1801 with strong opinions about architecture, Republican symbolism, and how an American president should live. Where John Adams had simply endured the unfinished mansion, Jefferson saw an opportunity. He could shape the building, bend it toward his own aesthetic and political vision, and leave a mark that would define how future presidents experienced the space. Jefferson had thought deeply about the president's house long before he held its keys. Years earlier, he had submitted his own design in the competition, a Palladian villa with a central rotunda and symmetrical wings. Now, as president, he found himself living in James Hoban's solid Georgian mansion, which he privately considered somewhat pedestrian and lacking in classical refinement. But Jefferson was nothing if not practical. Instead of tearing down what existed, he focused on strategic additions and improvements, changes that could enhance the building's function and beauty without requiring a complete rebuild. His most important structural contributions were the east and west terraces, low colonnaded wings stretching from either side of the main block. On paper, they seemed simple. In practice, they solved several problems at once. The terraces created additional service space, hiding stables, storage rooms, and work areas behind elegant rows of columns. They gave the mansion the kind of classical touches Jefferson believed a Republican building needed, horizontal colonnades that echoed ancient Roman architecture. And they linked the main residence to its outbuildings in a way that felt organized and deliberate rather than haphazard. In Jefferson's mind, these wings proved that beauty and utility did not have to conflict. A building could be both functional and refined, both practical and expressive of higher ideals. The terraces were built during his first term and became one of his most lasting contributions to the mansion's architecture. Inside, Jefferson directed his attention to the rooms where he actually lived and worked. He had little interest in huge ceremonial gatherings or elaborate state dinners with rigid formality. Instead, he preferred smaller, more intimate settings where he could engage in real conversation. He oversaw the furnishing of private study spaces, a well-stocked library filled with books on science, philosophy, and politics, and dining rooms suited to the kind of dinners that became his preferred method of conducting political business. Jefferson's approach to presidential entertaining was deliberately informal, at least by the standards of European courts. He often seated guests without regard to rank, served meals family style rather than with rigid ceremony, and encouraged open discussion. This was partly genuine Republican sentiment and partly calculated political strategy. Jefferson understood that informal settings put people at ease, loosened tongues, and allowed him to gather information and build alliances without the stiffness of official protocol. The East Room, which Abigail Adams had used for laundry, remained unfinished throughout Jefferson's entire 8-year presidency. He simply had no use for a grand ballroom. His political style did not require that kind of space, so he saw no reason to spend money completing it. Instead, he invested in the areas that mattered to him, places where he could read, write, experiment, and think. Jefferson was a passionate gardener and agronomist, and he treated the land around the president's house with the same attention he gave to the building itself. He oversaw the planting of trees, the layout of vegetable gardens, and the introduction of experimental crops. He imagined the president's house grounds as something between a working farm and a gentleman's estate, a landscape where productivity itself would signal Republican virtue. This was not idle decoration. It was a statement about what kind of nation America should be, rooted in agriculture, connected to the land, independent and self-sufficient. Slowly, under Jefferson's direction, the muddy construction site that had greeted John Adams began to look like a managed estate. Trees provided shade. Gardens produced food. The grounds took on a sense of order and purpose. From Jefferson's perspective, this transformation mirrored the broader work of building a republic, taking raw, chaotic nature and shaping it into something rational, beautiful, and productive. But beneath this cultivated surface, beneath the refined interiors and carefully planted gardens, lay a reality that Jefferson could never fully explain away, no matter how eloquently he wrote or how carefully he designed. The work of finishing and maintaining the president's house still depended heavily on enslaved labor. Jefferson brought enslaved people from Monticello, his Virginia plantation, to serve in the mansion. They worked as cooks, house servants, and laborers. They maintained his household, tended his gardens, and made his daily life as president possible, all while the law still counted them as his property. The contradiction was staggering and impossible to ignore, though many tried. Here was the author of the Declaration of Independence, the man who had written that all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights, running a presidential household staffed in part by men and women who could be bought and sold, who had no rights the law was bound to respect, who lived and worked at his command and could not leave. The building work during Jefferson's 2 terms followed the same pattern that had been set from the very beginning. The terraces he added, the landscape improvements he ordered, the interior finishing he supervised, all of it relied on a mixed workforce of free craftsmen and enslaved laborers. Some of the enslaved workers were highly skilled. Their labor made Jefferson's architectural vision possible. Yet the wages for their work, when wages were paid at all, went to their owners, not to them. Jefferson was not blind to this contradiction. In his private writings, he could acknowledge slavery as a moral evil and a long-term threat to the Republic. He wrote about the injustice of the system, the corrosive effect it had on both enslaved and enslaver, the danger it posed to the nation's future. But in his daily life and his actions rather than his words, he continued to depend on slavery. He bought and sold enslaved people. He inherited them, gave them as gifts, and used their labor to maintain his lifestyle and his political position. That tension, stark in his writings and even harsher in his actions, took physical form in the president's house. Here was a structure meant to embody the highest ideals of the Enlightenment, of reason, liberty, and human dignity. Yet it was built and maintained by a system that mocked every one of those ideals. The terraces, the gardens, the carefully arranged interiors that Jefferson added would outlast his time in office. They would shape how later presidents lived and worked in the mansion. But the moral compromises woven into the building during his tenure would also endure, embedded in the structure itself, waiting for future generations to confront them openly, even when that honesty threatened the comforting myths Americans had built around the founding era. And all of this careful work, all of Jefferson's refinements and contradictions, were about to be tested in the most brutal way imaginable. Not by political opposition or budget constraints, but by invading soldiers and open flame. The president's house was about to burn,